Hey y'all, welcome to Southern Five Felonies. This week and probably the next 2 weeks, we'll be talking about missing 411 cases. And if you're not familiar with those are all pretty much in different state parks, national parks. And I chose Yosemite to start us off. So I'm going to have uh, probably 10 unsolved cases a week. And we'll go ahead and get started on this one. In February 1977, a 24-year-old man named Stephen Gabaki was cross-country skiing through the snow near Lake Michigan. Once he reached the edge of the lake, he took his skis off to sit down and rest. When he got up to leave, his own tracks were gone, and he became lost. The last thing he remembers was walking through the snow, feeling numb and exhausted. He blacked out. In the blink of an eye, it was spring. Now remember now, we were in the middle of winter. He was laying in a grassy field in the middle of the forest, wearing clothes that weren't his. Sitting next to him was a stranger's backpack containing running shoes and glasses that did not belong to him either. He hiked to the nearest town and asked a local resident where he was. They told him he was in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, 700 miles away from where he had been skiing. His aunt and uncle and father lived in Pittsfield. So he knocked on his aunt's door. His family was in shock, hugging him and asking where he had been. Kubaki had been missing for 14 months. When Kubaki had first gone missing, the search team found his poles and his skis out the edge of the lake. There was only one set of footprints leading towards the water, but none walking away. Rescuers could only assume that he drowned himself in the freezing lake. He had been gone for so long, everyone assumed he must be dead. The official explanation from the park is that he had amnesia and that he was wandering in a fugue state. But even the doctors are baffled by this case. It's incredibly rare for someone to lose their memory of such a large chunk of time. And it still leaves so many unanswered questions. His story was included in a psychology case in a book about amnesia, but even the experts have been unable to figure out what exactly happened. Kabaki has already earned a degree in linguistics before he went missing, but he was also so fascinated by his own case that he went on to earn his PhD in psychology. He wanted answers and for his own disappearance, and yet he couldn't find them. Solving the mystery of his missing year became an obsession, and he went on to publish a book called Metamathematical Foundations of Existence. In it, he writes about the possibility of alternate universes. So, wow. Story 2. In 1981, an 84-year-old man named Maurice Damtez was topaz hunting with his friend David McSweeney. Maurice had a PhD in theology and in the 70s had said in several publications that he believed the Antichrist was coming. He wrote that the devil would appear as a political, religious, commercial autocrat of the world. I know that doesn't seem important, but it will a little bit later. They drove to Pike National Forest in Colorado. Once they were in the park, they had to drive 16 miles down a dirt road until they reached the spot called Topaz Point. Native Americans claimed it was haunted by evil spirits. Early settlers called the place the Devil's Head, which was a very interesting coincidence considering his theological background. Maurice could barely walk because he had bad knees. He needed David to help him down a small hill to get to a sandy digging spot in the forest. When it was time to leave, David walked back to Maurice's digging spot to tell him they should go in about 10 minutes. David went back to his own spot, and it was only 150 yards away, so he could somewhat see him to clean up his tools, but David returned to Maurice's spot. The elderly man was gone. With his bad knees, it would have been impossible for Maurice to climb up the hill on his own, and he couldn't have gotten far into the forest, yet he was gone. David honked the horn, called for him, and searched for him for a long time. McSweeney flagged down a car and asked him to find the police while he continued to search. The local authorities searched for 5 days, and yet they never found any evidence. The police closed the case, claiming that they did all that they could do. Maurice's wife sent a letter to the governor of Colorado to reopen the case, and she never received a reply, which is almost always an issue in all of these missing cases. After Pilates created a mini documentary about the cases for Missing 411, pointing out that there had been a cluster of similar disappearances in Devilhead, finally, the police reopened Maurice's case 30 years after his disappearance. So far, nothing has been found. There's no evidence of him ever being there, and it's one of the crazier ones. In February 2018, a Canadian man named Danny was on a ski trip with his friends in New York. It was around 2 p.m., and they had been skiing for hours. They were getting ready to go into the lodge, and Danny said that he wanted to go on one more run down the mountain before their lunch break. By 4 p.m., Danny was failing to return any calls or texts, and their friends were concerned. They began searching for him, and after being unable to find him, they told the employees at the lodge that he was missing. A team of 130 people scoured the mountain without finding him. 6 days later, Danny's wife received a phone call. She didn't recognize the number, and it sounded far away and staticky. It was Danny's voice. He was incoherent and confused, and then hung up on her because he couldn't figure out what was going on. She called the number back and pleaded with him to call 911 for help, so he finally did. He had no idea where he was, and he just kept describing his surroundings. When the paramedics finally found him, he was still wearing all of his ski gear and in need of medical assistance. He was holding a brand new iPhone, and someone had cut his hair. I don't know why someone cutting his hair is so creepy, but it really is, to me, anyway. Somehow, he ended up in Sacramento, California, at the airport terminal car rental depot. He was 3,000 miles away from where he disappeared. He couldn't remember how he got there, and he had no idea what day it was. When he learned where he was and how long people had been looking for him, he got very overwhelmed and emotional. The leading theory is that he was kidnapped in the back of a big rig truck, but no proof of this has ever surfaced. Nor has any information come from whoever decided that this was how he ended up where he was. I cannot find the information anywhere. That's the dumbest frickin' idea that I have ever heard. Of all the things that anybody could come up with, this is the best they could do. He got in a big rig truck and all of a sudden can't remember who the hell he is. Okay, all right. In July 2015, Dior Kuntz and his girlfriend Jessica Mitchell were on a camping trip with their 2-year-old son, Dior Jr. They brought along Jessica's grandfather and a family friend named Isaac. The campsite was extremely remote. On the edge of the Rocky Mountain National Park, there was only one dirt road leading to that area where they parked their trailer and car. Now imagine this. It's just this rocky road, and there's only one. There's not even 2 lanes. So no 2 people could come in together. It was one in, same out. That's it. The morning after their arrival, Jessica Dior and Dior Jr. all went to the nearby town to run some errands. When they came back to the campsite, Isaac was holding a large fish. He said he'd caught it in a nearby river. Jessica and Dior Sr. asked to see where he caught the fish, so they began to follow him with their son. The little boy suddenly decided he wanted to get candy from his grandfather, and they allowed him to walk by himself back to the campsite, which was only a few yards away. They could still almost see him, at least the top of his head. The grandfather confirmed that little Dior returned safely to him, and that he was watching over him, but in the blink of an eye, the toddler was gone. Now, in some interviews, the people that interviewed him said that they think that he went inside of the trailer to do whatever. He denied it, but it's a possibility. To be fair, and I want to be neutral. It is very suspicious, but I'm trying to remain neutral. During an interview, the parents explained they searched for the boy for about 20 minutes before calling 911. There was no cell phone service at the campsite, so they had to drive down the one road until they could complete the call. A search party helped them comb the area for several days with no sign of his scent or tracks. Helicopters and heat-seeking cameras flew over the area as well. A 2-year-old should not have been able to go very far. Everyone was baffled. Where is Dior Kuntz? Years later, the case is still unsolved. Many in the general public believe that Dior's parents are suspects, and there were multiple public outcries to have them tried for murder. However, there's no evidence that they actually killed their son. There's no evidence that he ever existed, other than, well, after he got to the park and all of a sudden was missing. Now, the friend of the family, Isaac, he's a freaking weirdo. If you watch the film Missing 411, you get to see like the whole case. And this guy, I mean, he's obviously developmentally challenged, and that's okay. I wouldn't have left my child with him just because, you know, you want somebody that is responsible to watch your kids. Well, he seemed really, really strange. And from what I could find, he already had some sort of sex crime issue. I cannot find exactly what it was, but from what I understand, it was not like a little baby, a child. It was some other, maybe somebody his age, more like. And then the grandfather, he seemed like he might have a little bit of dementia. I mean, he's passed on now, but at the time, he was not in good condition. I wouldn't have had my child stay with him either, just because he was so old and decrepit. He couldn't even get up to go fishing and stuff. He was stuck at the campsite because he wasn't very mobile. He had bad knees, he had bad legs, and him being older, he probably shouldn't even have been out there. But they wanted to include him since he was really outdoorsy, and that's how Isaac ended up coming. The parents did not know Isaac at all. Isaac was one of the grandfather's friends, and usually every summer they would take some sort of vacation, and that particular summer this was the vacation they took. So Isaac, of course, wanted to go too, and they didn't have any problem with it. They were fine. But that is all the information there is. Usually if a child was taken by a mountain lion or something like there, there's going to be blood. There's going to be his shoes were like slip-on shoes. So if you were being drugged by an animal, one of your shoes would have come off, or a piece of clothing, or you know so many different things. But no, not in this situation. The only thing that it actually looked like the child never went with them. And it was totally bizarre. It's like, imagine, you take your child to go camping, everything's fine. You got one road in and out, so there's no way that, he can just wander off somewhere too far away from where he was. And then he's missing. He's gone forever. It's super strange. In 2014, a medical doctor named James McRogan went on a split snowboard trip with friends in Vail, Colorado. Not too many people have heard of split snowboarding. It's a sport that's kind of like cross country skiing or hiking in snowshoes. He came prepared with his cell phone and a satellite GPS system. He was much faster than his friends, so he said that he would wait for them at the next stop. And the next stop was not far. Each stop, is an equal distance, to give people a chance to catch up to each other, rest, and then move on together. They lost sight of him and never saw him at any stops along the trail. When the search team went looking for him, they found no tracks in the snow that veered off the trail, so they had no idea where he could possibly have gone. 5 days later, his body was discovered 4.5 miles away as the crow flies, which was more like a 14-mile hike. as he would have had to climb up mountains in order to get there. His body was found by two hikers at the bottom of the frozen waterfall in that area. The search party had gone over that area multiple times before, but had never seen him until that day. And this part's pretty creepy. McGrogan was mangled in a strange position. His skull was crushed as if he had fallen from the sky. He was still wearing a full ski outfit and helmet, but there were no boots on his feet, and he had also taken off his gloves. The search and rescue team later found his discarded split snowboard, but they never found his boots. His cell phone and GPS were still working, and he had packed a backup battery as well. They tested the area where he was found, and there was a cell phone signal, yet he never called for any help. The police deemed this as an accidental death, but I call bullshit. I just think it's totally bizarre that it's not very often in these cases I find that people actually have the wherewithal to bring a cell phone plus an extra battery and a GPS, because he had to be missing in some other area as far as his GPS goes, because they would have tracked him to that area. But he was accidentally found in an area that he should have never been. And there was no footprints, no, they never found his boots. It's just totally bizarre. And the fact that they said, what really got me, I've been having nightmares for the past 2 weeks because of this. Not just this case, but all of them together. When they said that his skull was crushed, not as if he, fell and hit his head on a rock, but as if he had fallen from the sky. How about, no, no. You will never catch me in a national park after doing this research. No way. The last thing I want to do is go and sweat my ass off on a mountain and then get abducted by aliens. That is some bullshit. Like, who enjoys that? Definitely not me. In 1952, a 2-year-old boy named Keith Parkins was missing from his home in Ritter, Oregon, in the middle of winter. He had been playing outside with his jacket on, but he was far from equipped to spend the night outside alone. His family and a local search party looked for him immediately. They could follow his tiny footprints up to a point before they completely stopped. There were no other animals or adult tracks nearby. 19 hours later, and remember, it's freezing outside, they found Keith. He was 15 miles away. What? A 2-year-old boy. There is no way in the snow and the cold or any conditions that he could walk 15 miles. He had taken his jacket off and was laying face down in the snow on a frozen pond. Believe it or not, Keith was alive. When they asked him why he had run away and how he survived, he said he didn't remember. A survival expert named Lee Stroud filmed a segment for the Missing 411 documentary to demonstrate just how impossible it would have been for a 2-year-old to walk so far on his own, especially at night. To this day, no one is sure how exactly Keith survived the night, and we may never know. Also, another thing that I noted was that this guy, he's way older now. His mom had the wherewithal to keep his clothing that he was wearing that day. And he had some tears in his little jacket because they guessed he climbed through a barbed wire fence, but that's a stretch. 15 miles away, and we're talking about 19 hours. The, no, there's just no way. But in the Missing 411 movie that I was talking about earlier, they interviewed this guy, and he tells a little bit about his story, but with almost all these cases of people that were missing under strange circumstances, they never remember anything. Or they might remember what they were doing, like an hour previous to whatever happened to them. So all these people come back with amnesia, and it's like, I want to know what the hell's going on, because I don't want to be probed. I don't want to be assaulted by Bigfoot. None of that. None of that. No, thank you. As far as cases go, and I've researched many, many cases for this particular podcast, I think this is my favorite as far, and I hate to say favorite, but it's the most interesting. That seems probably better to say, is that it's my most interesting. It's just, it's unreal. And, I have show notes, anything you guys want. If you want to research it yourself, just let me know. And, I can give you all my information. So let's get started. It was Father's Day weekend, 1969. 6-year-old Dennis Martin was at the Smoky Mountains National Park with his brother, father, and grandfather. They camped out for the night, and the next day, a man approached Mr. Martin, asking if his sons wanted to play with his kids since they were about the same age. Dennis's father agreed, and the children started to play a big game of hide and seek. Dennis's father kept his eyes on his son from a distance. Dennis hid behind a tree, and when the other kids jumped to reveal themselves, Dennis didn't. His father got up and ran over to where he had last seen his son, and he was gone. The Appalachian Trail was nearby. And if you know anything about the Appalachian Trail, I mean, we have that here, and it's not always an easy hike. It's always a little creepy. And there are quite a few disappearances in this area. I mean, all the time. Usually it gets chalked up to, an animal attack or whatever, but yeah, that's what I would say too if I was trying to hide something. Anyway, like I said, the Appalachian Trail was nearby, so he ran at full speed for 2 miles, yelling and calling for Dennis, but he couldn't find his son. They called park rangers and spent all night looking for him. The search for Dennis Martin became massive. The FBI, the Green Berets, park rangers, and a local volunteer group searched for 6 weeks. The only thing they found belonging to Dennis was one shoe and one sock. They never found a body. Politis conducted interviews and dug through files with testimonies that had already been done. And, he looked at it with fresh eyes. The Key family, who had also been camping in the park that weekend, approached park rangers asking, where they could go to see bears. So they were told where to go, and when they arrived, they reported hearing a scream. It doesn't say, it took me a long time to find out where this was in relation to where he disappeared. It was 5 miles, or actually a little bit less than that. After they reported hearing a scream, the child that was with the family pointed at the top of the hill saying that he saw a bear. The father said no. It looked more like a scary, wild, hairy mountain man. That's a quote. Dodging behind trees while carrying a little boy over his shoulder. Now, I'm sure that there's lots of things that we could ideally, use as a reason why this happened, or what that was or whatever. But just imagine you're out chillaxing and all of a sudden fucking Bigfoot grabs your child and takes it. God knows where they went. Now, and I'm not I'm not saying that it's Bigfoot, and I'm not saying that it's aliens or anything like that. I'm just letting you know different people's views, and you can make up your own mind. It's always fun, to speculate, but that is super creepy. The family seeing this scary, hairy mountain man carrying a little boy over his shoulder. It's like, why didn't you tell the park rangers immediately instead of the next day when they found out that a child was missing. And there's also an issue that we run into. So if you know anything about being in the service, you know the Green Berets do not do any sort of missing persons cases. They are, a specialist group that, they do their thing. You can research that if you want to. Um, the Green Berets come up in several of these cases, but yet they refuse to work with the park rangers and the local police and FBI, which the FBI is not, they normally don't do missing cases either, but it's a lot more frequent than the Green Berets. There's a lot of material. You can research it yourself. But, in the next few episodes, I'll make sure that I, give you the information about what I found. But there's a lot of rumors about what could be going on here. Right now, I just want to kind of get you started on the different stories, and that way you can have something to compare to each other and, you know, see what you think before I give you, the lowdown on how these groups work and, who decides who gets called in, for these disappearances and, how many search parties that they have. And, these search and rescue parties, these people, they're not just volunteers. We're talking about people that have been trained for years and years and years, for tracking and, they bring the dogs in. A lot of times the dogs can't smell a trail or they refuse to and they, kind of hunker down and they're like, we don't want to do that. So we're scared. So that's not going to be in this episode, but the very next episode it will be. And it'll be easier for you to understand why I'm like super excited about several episodes on this because the speculation and some of the actual things that, you know, have been documented. It is so bizarre, that our government would be like, let's not talk about this. Let's, just, oh, we don't know. We don't know what happened. That's real sad. It was an animal. So, keep that in mind. And for sure, the next episode, I'll make sure that I describe, all the different groups that come in and, a lot of the speculation. In 1958, a 10-year-old partially deaf boy named Bobby Bizup was attending a Catholic camp for boys called Camp St. Malo. It sits on the border of the Rocky Mountain National Park. A camp counselor found him fishing at the river because he loved to fish and told him to come back to the camp for dinner. The boy started to follow him, and when the counselor glanced over his shoulder to double check to make sure Bobby was still there, he had disappeared. 400 people searched for 9 days but found no clues. 1 year later, counselors found his hearing aid and bits of torn clothing 2,000 feet up the side of the mountain. Now, this little guy, he was tiny. He was a little bit small for his age of 10. And imagining him scaling 2,000 feet up the side of a mountain is unreal. They presented the information that they had to doctors and animal researchers, and they said no, it would not have been an animal. And an animal is more of a opportune meal lover. They don't want to do a whole lot of work. So for his hearing aid and his torn clothing to be 2,000 feet up the side of the mountain, it's a little strange. Yes, it could have been an animal. I'm no expert. I just am reporting to you what I read, and we'll see where it goes from here. The search party had already searched that area at least 3 times the year before. 3 times. And this is something else that runs through all these cases, is that they're searched multiple times, and then out of nowhere the stuff appears. Sometimes the clothes are folded in a neat pile, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's super exciting, to have such, strange things to look into. And it's like, what's really going on here? None of his other remains have ever been found. And you have to remember how many hundreds of thousands of people go in and out of these parks all the time, and they hike, they camp, they walk, so it's just unreal, how the evidence is just not there. In 1999, a 3-year-old boy named Jared Atadero was living with his sister and his father, Alan, at a resort Jared's dad worked at in the Comanche Wilderness, which is a national park in Colorado. A Christian singles group was staying at the resort, and one of the women in the group offered to take Alan's kids with them for a few hours to the local fish hatchery. They never asked Alan if they could take the children hiking as well, but they saw a sign for a nearby trail and decided at the last minute that they would go through the forest with somebody else's children. The Christian singles were so involved in their own hikes that they lost track of Jared, and he wandered away from the group. 2 fishermen in the area saw him walking alone, but assumed his parents must be nearby. After this, he was never seen again. In 2003, 2 hikers climbed up a very steep rock face, roughly 550 feet above the trail. Okay, remember, this kid's 2 to 3 years old. Okay? They found one child's tooth, a piece of skull, and Jared's clothing, which were fully intact. They had been taken off his body and turned inside out. There was one shoe which looked brand new. Somehow, it was perfectly preserved for all 4 years that it was out there. The area where his remains were found was far too difficult for a child to climb to himself, and it would have been an unnecessary difficult location for an adult kidnapper to take him. It also doesn't line up with the bear or cougar attack pattern because the clothes would have been ripped and covered in blood. This boy's poor father, also in Missing 411, this guy, it pulls at your heartstrings because, he thought that these kids were going to be right down the road. The fish hatchery was like 3 to 5 miles away. And, one of the group of the Christian singles came running into his office and said, "Hey, we can't find Jared." And of course, having children, your heart breaks because you're like, oh my God, I need to go find him. He's fine, I'm sure, but let's just go look for him. Nope, nope, nothing. Nothing was found. And they talked to the 2 fishermen, and, of course, they were excluded as suspects. It was just, it's creepy. Finding one tooth, his clothes were totally intact. Um, him being so young, he could only travel by himself so far before he get really exhausted. And, a lot of people say it was, a cougar attack, but not the same people that are actually scientists that work with these animals. They're like, no, it can't be a cougar attack or, any sort of wildcat or even a bear because they don't drag the child all that way, you know, 500 feet above the trail and still have both of his shoes on, his pants, his coat. And I don't know any cougars personally besides myself, but, you know, I don't know any for sure that take your clothes and turn them inside out. I mean, I guess, okay, it was the first time for everything, I suppose.